Hello friends, very good morning. Welcome to the Hindu editorial analysis. The title of today's editorial says Home and Abroad. Home and Abroad. PM Modi's G7 commitments on protecting freedoms will face scrutiny in India. So they've used this title in this context. Whatever Mr. Modi is saying abroad will face scrutiny at home. So he is saying so many things out of India. He is giving a lot of commitments on protecting freedoms to the global world. But within India, there are allegations, there are instances that Modi's government is curbing freedom, is controlling freedom, is suppressing freedom of the press. So whatever commitments he is giving out of India or abroad will face scrutiny in India. That is the meaning of this title and this sentence. Here we are seeing something called G7. What is this G7? Let's look at some background about G7. Whenever we read editorial, it is very important that we understand the background of every key word that is mentioned over there. So here we are talking about something called G7. If you go back to history, it started somewhere in 1975. It was launched by former French President Valéry Giscard. So in the first meeting, only 6 countries participated. What are the countries which participated? Germany, France, Great Britain, Italy, Japan and the United States. So group of 6, they participated in the first meeting. After that, in 1976, Canada was added to the group and it became G7. At that time, these countries were world's leading economies. So they informally met to discuss the problems of that time. Whatever were the problems of 1970, oil crisis and exchange rate issues, they wanted to discuss all those issues, economic problems of 1970, and they started meeting every year after that. In 1981, even European community, today we are calling it European Union, they were also invited since then. Since 1981, European Union has also been part of all these sessions, right? And since 1980s, they also started discussing, apart from economic problems, they also started discussing foreign as well as security problems of the world as well. They started discussing foreign and security aspects of the security policy issues as well, right? And Russia was also a member. 1998, Russia was also a member of this group. It was added to the group and G7 became G8. With the inclusion of Russia, it became G8. But in 2014, Russia was thrown out of the group and it again became G7. Why was it thrown out of group? Because Russia violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It occupied Crimea Island. It annexed Crimea Island, which violated Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and because of which Russia was thrown out of the grouping, right? So this is 2022 and these G7 countries met at Germany. So Germany is the host for G7 summit this year. If you look at G7 as a whole, the significance of G7 countries together make up 10% of world's population. Together they make 10% of population, 31% of world's GDP, 21% of global carbon dioxide emissions. They together make up 21% of global carbon dioxide emissions. One thing is, in 1975 they were the prominent countries, but if you look at today, even India, China, South Africa, Brazil, even these countries became much bigger economies. In 1975 these were not big economies. In today's context, these are much bigger economies than some of the countries of G7. Right? So this is some background about G7. So let's look at it. And India was invited as a special guest, special invitee. So India also joined the meeting there. Right. So geopolitics trumped economics at the annual summit of the world's most industrialized countries, as the G7 is known, at the German resort of Schloss-Elmau, a summit Prime Minister Narendra Modi attended along with other special invitees from Argentina, Indonesia, Senegal and South Africa. Argentina, Indonesia, Senegal, South Africa and India. These 5 are the special invitees to this particular G7 summit. Summit is a meeting of all the heads of nation. Right? All the highest authorities of country, if they are meeting, we call it summit. We call it summit. Highest level meeting among different countries is called summit. So in this summit, Narendra Modi also attended as a special invitee along with Argentina, Indonesia, Senegal and South Africa. And G7 was once known as the grouping of most industrialized nations, because these were the most industrialized nations in 1970s when it was formed. While the G7 countries did have some economic initiatives on their agenda. One second, I missed out one point. See this, geopolitics trumped economics. G7, when it was formed to discuss economic problems. We discussed it, right, just now, in 1970s, economic issues of 1970s. So predominantly whenever G7 countries meet, they discuss economic problems of that time. But this time around, geopolitics, political aspects trumped, means defeated economics. More than the economic issues, they discussed the geopolitical tensions that are happening in the world today, especially between Russia and Ukraine and some other things that are happening today. So those issues dominated economics at the annual summit of world's most industrialized countries this year. While the G7 countries did have some economic initiatives on their agenda, including the launch of a $600 billion US-led partnership for the global infrastructure and investment, which is also referred to as PGII, commitments on climate change, funding renewable energy changes, mitigating inflation and managing the continued global crisis over the COVID-19 pandemic. It was clear that most of the deliberations took aim at the twin challenges seen from Russia and China. Very, very important sentence. So please pay attention to every word that is being written here. That was written here, that was mentioned here. Just take a look at it. So in the previous sentence, the editorial mentioned that G7 this time focused more on geopolitics than economics. Here they are saying it doesn't mean they did not discuss any economic initiatives. They also discussed some economic initiatives. What are they? They discussed the launch of $600 billion US-led partnership for global infrastructure and investment. Very, very important. So take a look at it. So they discussed the launch of PGII partnership. So what is mentioned here? Take a look at it. US-led partnership for global infrastructure and investment, PGII. So let's understand a bit about this. Whenever you see such keywords, we must immediately jump into the background of it, right? Analysts say this was proposed as a counter. This is being proposed as a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. China's Belt and Road Initiative. First, let's understand what is this China's Belt and Road Initiative. Let's look at China's Belt and Road Initiative and then understand what this PGII is. So, China's Belt and Road Initiative. So, China's Belt and Road Initiative was started. China began this initiative in 2013 under its president Xi Jinping. We all know about it. But what was the objective of BRI? The objective of BRI was to revive ancient trade routes. Ancient trade routes crossing China from Rome in Europe to East Asia. From Europe to East Asia. The BRI initiative aims to establish trade routes between these two areas. Right. Under this, what is Chinese government is doing? It is trying to provide loans. China government is trying to provide loans to various countries, various developing countries, because these developing countries cannot fund such infrastructure projects. They cannot fund such infrastructure projects on their own. So China is providing loans to them, and most of these projects are being awarded to Chinese companies. Chinese companies are doing the work of most of these infra projects. These infra projects include rail, road, and also maritime connectivity. So maritime connectivity requires building a lot of ports. Right? So China is focusing on these things. It's a infrastructure development initiative. As a counter to this, now all these G7 countries are proposing to come up with partnership for global infrastructure and investment. So this is a counter to BRI. So what are these countries going to do? These countries, they announced the launch of, they were talking about PGII in 2021 itself, but they officially launched it now. At that time, Joe Biden called it B3W framework. What is B3? BBB. Build Back Better World. Build Back Better World. That's what they mentioned in 2021, but they did not create any framework at that time. But this time around, the initiative was officially launched. So what is the purpose of this PGII? Again, to secure funding. Secure funding for countries. Funding for countries to build infra projects. To build infra such as roads, ports, bridges, etc. to enhance global trade and communication. Right? So it is similar to BRI, but these guys are saying we are going to be transparent. We are going to build climate change resilient infrastructure. Right? Whatever infrastructure we are going to build, it will be resilient. So it will withstand the pressures of floods, tsunamis, etc. Right? And that's what these guys are trying to say. But from where funds will come and what is the benefit for India? If you look at from India's point of view, US International Development Finance Corporation will fund certain projects in India. Under PGII, US International Development Finance Corporation will fund certain projects in India. It is going to invest up to $3 million in India in especially agri, food and climate areas. agriculture, food systems and climate areas. They are going to invest so much money in India under PCII. So just keep it in mind, it is a counter to BRI, which was launched in 2013 by China. The 28-page communique alternated between outlining the challenges to the international order that emanate from Moscow's war in Ukraine and Beijing's expansive maritime claims, rights violations and unsustainable debt creation in lower income countries. Very, very important sentence. What is this communique? Communique is nothing but a joint statement which is released after these kind of summits. So this communique alternated between what? Outlining the challenges to the international order. So you are seeing a keyword here, very, very important. Whenever you read, you should focus on keywords. What is the meaning of international order? When someone says international order, it means the body of rules, systems, regulations that all the member countries of the world follow. All the rules, regulations and systems and organizations all the member countries of the world follow. That is called international order. For example, with respect to sea, right, there is something called UN clause, United Nations Convention on Law of Seas, UN clause. So if someone wants to maintain international order, what does that mean? All the countries must abide by the guidelines, of UN clause. Right? If there are some international conventions, treaties, rules, regulations, all the countries of the world must abide by them. When everyone is abiding by them, we say there is international order. We are respecting international order. If someone is not abiding, then we say there are challenges to international order. See here, so we are facing challenges to international order. From where are they coming? They emanate from, which means they originate from, they are coming from Moscow's war in Ukraine. In Ukraine, Russia declared a war, you know that. It is not fair, right? You cannot encroach into someone's territory. It is like encroaching into someone's territory. It is violating Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, right? Territorial integrity and sovereignty. That is something that's happening there. And also, they also discussed tightening sanctions. What is the meaning of sanctions? Sanction is something, a punishment for someone not following a rule, for someone not obeying a treaty, for someone not behaving in an expected manner. Since Russia did not behave in expected manner, what is expected manner? Respecting others' sanctity, respecting others' sovereignty. Since Russia did not respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, Russia was imposed certain sanctions. Sanctions are some punishing actions. So what did these European countries do? They stopped importing oil from Russia, right? They stopped transacting with Russia. They're trying to disconnect Russia from international financial systems. So they discussed tightening of these sanctions and the impact on energy markets. Since Russia exports a lot of oil and gas to European countries, and since these countries decided not to import it, so there is an impact on energy markets. The prices of gas, the prices of crude oil, everything shot up, and cyber security threats. So they discussed all these things in this. All these things were mentioned in the communique. This is from the perspective of Russia. Now coming to Beijing. Beijing's expansive maritime claims, very, very important. What is the meaning of expansive? Expansive means covering a wide area. So China always says, this entire sea is mine. It doesn't follow UN clause. We spoke about it, right? United Nations Convention on Law of Seas. Instead of abiding by UN clause, China says this entire thing is mine. That is why he's saying expansive maritime claims. Rights violations. There are certain human right violations that are happening, and unsustainable debt creation. Very, very important sentence. Unsustainable debt creation. We just spoke about it. As part of BRI, Brick and Road Initiative, what did China do? China started lending money to low income countries via certain banks, Asian Development Bank and some other banks, right? So these low income countries, they took loans from China, or the China funded banks. They started investing in infrastructure projects, but now they are unable to repay the money. That is why it is called unsustainable debt creation. Debt, you understand, right? Giving money, loan. Unsustainable. Why it is unsustainable? These low income countries are unable to pay it back. So China is creating such a debt, it is not sustainable. Those countries are unable to pay. Since they are unable to pay, what is China doing? It is taking control over those infrastructure assets in other countries. Right? Understand this? This is China. This is another country, let's say ABC. ABC Limited, ABC country has started a project and China gave money. China gave money. I'm symbolizing it with dollars. Right? But ABC is unable to pay back money to China, and China or Chinese companies are slowly taking control over these assets in foreign countries. This is what China is trying to do. So G7 countries, in the communique, even this was also mentioned. I hope you are getting everything. The G7 countries issued separate statements on support for Ukraine, food security, and a climate club. They issued separate statements on support for Ukraine, food security, and climate club. Climate club is nothing but maintaining this infrastructure and other things, keeping climate in mind. So they are trying to cut down on carbon emissions completely. They want to cut down decarbonized road network by 2030. What does that mean? Whenever they build a road, they will ensure that there is no carbon used. While creating infrastructure, it should not lead to any pollution. It should not lead to any non-green initiative. So this is called green infra. You are creating infra using green means, non-polluting means, non-pollution causing means. In addition, the G7 and special invitee partner countries issued a statement on resilient democracies, committing to free and fair elections, protecting freedom of expression and gender empowerment. Apart from that, what did they do? G7 and the special invitee partner countries, India, Senegal, Indonesia, all these countries, they issued a statement. All of them issued a statement on resilient democracies, committing to free and fair elections. Very, very important sentence. Resilient, and what is the meaning of resilient? To come back. Right? Resilient means someone who bounces back. A democracy, resilient democracies means democracies which are hit but they are bouncing back. So they issued a statement on resilient democracies, committing to free and fair elections. A democracy is premised on free and fair elections. What is a democracy? We say rule by people, right? We say rule by people. A democracy is successful only when there are free and fair elections. Only then there is a freedom of expression. Democracy encourages criticism. The government should allow people to criticize them, which means people should have freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Any country which doesn't give freedom of expression to its citizens cannot call itself a democratic country. Right? A democracy should encourage criticism. A democracy should encourage expression. A democracy should give freedom to all its people to express their views. Right? So that is why they are saying we are committed on resilient democracies and we are committed to free and fair elections, protecting freedom of expression and gender empowerment. The message for Russia and China was made even more pointed at the subsequent NATO summit. After this G7, there was a summit in Madrid. It was attended by all NATO countries, where the US's transatlantic allies invited the USS Trans-Pacific allies to discuss security challenges. Trans-Atlantic means across the border of Atlantic River, Atlantic Ocean. Here, across the border of Pacific Ocean. So these allies were also invited to NATO's summit to discuss security challenges. Apart from NATO countries, USS Trans-Pacific allies were also invited to this meeting to discuss several security challenges that Ukraine is facing with Russia and other things. So next, given the targeted nature of the G7 outcomes, India had its work cut out as a balancing power. Very, very important sentence. So this is a very important sentence. Given the targeted nature of the G7 outcome, look at this. G7 outcomes are targeting certain countries, right? Whom are they targeting? They are targeting Russia and China. Clearly they are targeting a particular segment. And India had its task cut out as a balancing power. Very important sentence. If someone has its task cut out, which means they have a very difficult task ahead. I have a task cut out means I have a very difficult task ahead of me, and that is the meaning of that sentence. Here it says balancing power. What is the meaning of balancing power? How does US look at India? US looks at India as a country that balances the power of China. China wants to have hegemony. Hegemony means dominance over entire Asia, and US looks at India to counter China's dominance, to balance the dominance of China. So generally India is seen as a balancing power, but India wants to be seen as a leading power, not as a balancing power. That's a separate discussion. Let's discuss some other time. Since India is seen as a balancing power, India is generally not part of any group. It is neither part of China-led group nor part of US-led group. So India is somewhere in the middle. It follows non-alignment policy. It is neither part of this group nor part of that group. Prime Minister Modi made it clear that it is the developing world that needs the most support. He says the developing world that needs the most support, including to weather the knock-on effects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What is the meaning of knock-on effect? What is the meaning of knock-on effect? Which means the indirect effect. Because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we are also facing some knock-on or indirect effects. For example, sunflower, which we generally import from Ukraine, we are unable to import now, sunflower oil. So we are facing high prices of edible oils, which is sunflower oil. And there are so many other things which we are facing today. Since Russia is unable to export a lot of its oil, there is a supply crisis and the oil prices shot up. All these are knock-on effects. There is another word called weather. Weather means to withstand, to handle, to face. To face these knock-on effects of Russia-Ukraine conflict, the developing world needs the most support. You guys need to support the developing world. That's what Modi is saying. The government sought to distance itself from the PZII. It sought to distance itself from the PZII, pitched as a G7 counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. We discussed this. PZII was pitched as a counter to China's BRI and made it evident that India had only signed on the statements on resilient democracy. We only signed on the statements of resilient democracy and just energy transition, and not on this PZII. Right? That was G7's counter to BRI. We are neither part of G7 nor part of China's bloc. What is the meaning of just here? Just here means fair. It doesn't mean just like that, not that just. Just here means fair energy transition, and not the many statements castigating Russia and China, much like Mr. Modi had at the earlier BRICS summit, stayed away from President Putin and President Xi's stringent criticism of the West. Look at this. Very, very interesting. There are two blocks. BRICS, G7. India was part of this group. India attended G7 summit as a special invitee. During the BRICS summit, Russian president and Chinese president, they castigated, which means they criticized the West. West means the US and the European countries heavily, and India stayed away from it. India stayed away from that criticism. Similarly, in this G7 summit, the G7 meeting, they targeted Russia and China. Again, India stayed away. India stayed away from directly targeting China and Russia. That's what they are saying here. Very, very important. So, India had only signed on resilient democracies and fair energy transition, and not the many statements castigating Russia and China. What you are issuing so many statements castigating, which means criticizing or condemning Russia and China, and we are not signing on that. We are not signing on that. Similarly, even during BRICS summit, India stayed away from President Putin and President Xi's stringent criticism of the West. On the global stage, the G7 outcomes mean New Delhi will have to continue to walk a tight rope between these two blocks. On one hand, you have BRICS, BRICS. On the other hand, there is G7. So G7 is targeting the Western countries, Russia and China, and the BRICS, especially Russia and China in BRICS, is targeting the Western world. So India will have to continue to walk a tightrope. Walk a tightrope means go in a delicate manner. Go in a delicate manner. So India cannot afford to be part of any group. It has to maintain a fine balance between these two groups. There are some areas where our interests are aligned with Russia and China, especially in the issues like World Trade Organization. India and China's issues are aligned because both are seen as developing countries, and both of them criticize the policies of the Western world. And Russia has been a very good friend of India for quite some time. And there are some other issues where India stays close with US. So India has to maintain a tight balance between two blocks and that are growing more polarized and inimical towards each other. Polarized means it's like South Pole and North Pole. They're becoming distant, right? The distance between the two groups is growing every day, and they are being inimical towards each other. Inimical means harmful, hostile, unfriendly. Both groups or blocks are becoming unfriendly to each other. Not all the countries, especially Russia and China, one block. Western countries and the US, European countries and the US, another block. On the Indian stage, Mr. Modi's G7 commitments. What are the G7 commitments? Let's look at these commitments. He is talking about free and fair elections. He is talking about free and fair elections. Look at this: committing to free and fair elections, protecting freedom of expression, gender empowerment. These are the commitments Modi gave in G7 summit. They will be scrutinized for his pronouncements on democracy. Obviously, these commitments, his pronouncements on democracy will be scrutinized, and his written assurance that his government will protect civic society, freedoms of expression and thought, conscience, religion and belief, which are facing challenges within the country. Obviously, all these things are today facing challenges in India, but he is giving broad commitments abroad that we will protect civic society, we will protect freedom of expression. So all these statements will be scrutinized by Indian media here. So there is a word civic society here. It is important to understand. In any country, look at this. On one side you have government, on the other side you have business. On one side you have government, on the other side you have business or the corporate world. Something that is neither part of government nor part of business but represents the interests of people, is part of civic society. That is called civic society. For example, let's say there is a farmer union. It is neither part of business nor part of government. It represents the interests of farmers. It is part of civic society. Let's say there is a trade union. Again, labor union. It represents the interests of industrial labor. It is neither part of the capitalist society or the industry nor part of the government. Again, it is part of civic society. Or any society, any grouping based on a caste, any society based on a religion, all of them are part of civic society. Or all the NGOs, non-governmental organizations, right? All of them are part of civic society. And civic society almost always question the policies of the government. They fight with the government. Sometimes they work with the government, sometimes they fight the government. If the government is doing some actions which are not doing good to people, civic society questions it. So protecting the freedom of civic society is important in a democracy, because people alone cannot do anything. So whatever they want to convey, they do it via civic society. So it is very, very important to protect the freedom of expression of civic society, the freedom of expression of press, and the freedom of expression of all the people. Only then democracy thrives in any society. I hope you have understood the entire essence of the passage. In this manner, we will do editorial analysis line by line every day. Take care. Bye-bye.